Hey, everybody. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the Battle of the Alamo, which was in February and March of 1836. You might notice I've miraculously recovered from my cold. So I've got a map up. I'm going to send it. Like always, I advise you to take a look at the map. I just think it's really, really helpful. And what I want to point out is on this map, Santa Anna's reaction to when his brother-in-law, General Coss, was kicked out of San Antonio in December of 1835. Santa Anna was furious. He vowed revenge, as was always the case. Mexico City is extremely sensitive about its northeastern frontier because there's always a dangerous border on the northeastern frontier. In the Spanish period, it was Louisiana, and in the Mexican period, it's the US. So Santa Anna has decided he's going to come, and after crushing Zacatecas, again, there were all kinds of revolts against Santa Anna after he grabbed power in 1835, not just in Texas. Zacatecas, the Yucatan. Zacatecas is very important for our story because, by the way, if you've never been to Zacatecas, it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful mining town in Mexico, just really gorgeous. But Santa Anna had come in, pretty much ransacked Zacatecas, and then he set his eyes on the northeastern province, which is Texas. And what you need to see here, if you're looking at the map, you can see on the lower left, it starts with F, the grid F. This is a very nice map. I really like it. You can see Santa Anna, he's in the interior of Mexico, and it's going to take a while for him to gather his army. He ultimately has an army of about 5,000 or so very well-armed men that he's going to march into Texas, but it's going to take a while for him to gather that army. And when they start marching, they march through the interior of Mexico and from San Luis Potosi, and they cross the Rio Grande, probably right around where Eagle Pass is, north of Laredo. That was the most direct line. And my guess would be he crossed the Rio Grande near where San Juan Bautista used to be, because remember, that's the gateway into Texas. And it's still the gateway into Texas. So that's where Santa Anna is crossing the Rio Grande. But what you need to remember is that his army is not marching in one block. It's strung along for dozens and dozens, maybe over 100 miles, because the roads aren't really great. So he can't march 6,000 men shoulder to shoulder to San Antonio. They're strung out along the road. It's going to take weeks for his entire army to get to San Antonio once he reaches San Antonio on February 23rd. And most importantly, his artillery. That's at the rear, that his heavy artillery. That's what takes the longest to march, and that's the last to arrive in San Antonio. And I'll explain the importance of that as I go on and talk more about the battle. So what happens is that Santa Anna is marching north from San Luis Potosi. He runs into weather problems. It's one of the worst winters in the history of 19th century Mexico. He actually has to deal with a snowstorm, which is very unusual for that part of Mexico. And on his way up, he has his Minister of Justice issue a decree called the Tornel Decree, and I put that under the keywords in this box. Tornel was the person that ran the judiciary in Mexico. And basically what Santa Anna had him issue a decree saying that Santa Anna could kill anyone, he could legally execute anyone that opposed the Mexican army. So Santa Anna has decided to move up into Texas and kind of do what Arredondo had done in 1813. He's going to basically do Arredondo version 2. He's going to come up into San Antonio. He's going to wipe out the forces that are opposing him, which are east of San Antonio. And he's going to be merciless. And remember, Santa Anna had been with Arredondo in 1813. So he had been an eyewitness to La Quinta. He'd been an eyewitness to the executions of civilians. He'd fought in the Battle of Medina. So he's trying to do basically what Arredondo did 2 decades before that. Santa Anna he was a young Spanish officer at that point. So he's marching, and you can see that red line. Now, as I talked about in the previous podcast, the defenders of the Alamo had decided, under Jim Bowie, had decided not to leave San Antonio. And this is a big mistake. I'm going to show you a video of the battle. But the Alamo grounds, which are pretty small now, a lot of people, when we have friends come to San Antonio, they're disappointed with how small the Alamo is. But the Alamo used to have walls that extended out basically almost, maybe 100 yards. And you'll see the image of the Alamo in this little video I'm going to post as part of these lectures. And long story short, the Alamo was just too big to defend because there were only about 187, little less than 200 Texans. We think 187, but the exact number doesn't matter. There were just too few men to protect the Alamo. Now, I want to talk about the kind of mixed army or militia that was defending the Alamo. And what you had 4 different leaders. You had Jim Bowie and his men, and some of his men were actually Tejano because Bowie had married into the Barramundi family. And some of his men, a few were Tejano. You had William Barrett Travis, who was actually appointed the commander of the Alamo by the Texas Provisional Government. Travis shows up in early 1836. And very quickly, Travis and Jim Bowie get into fights. They hate each other. They can't stand each other. So there's quite a bit of division within the ranks. And then in the midst of all this, Davy Crockett, the famous Davy Crockett, appears. Davy Crockett is an interesting story. He is arguably the first American that's famous for being famous. He was a frontiersman at a time when, especially the East Coast, was urbanizing. He created these tall stories about his adventures fighting bears. And, there's this famous story where he said, I wasn't lost in the wilderness, but I was a mite confused for a couple of days. So he was this kind of very down-home, colorful, rural figure that actually wrote books, autobiographies. He wrote bestsellers. He had a play on Broadway that he starred in, where he plays this kind of rough and rugged frontiersman to an urban audience. He worked his way into politics. Unlike Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, who was also from Tennessee, got crossways with Sam Houston. Got crossways with Andrew Jackson. So Sam Houston was a protege of Andrew Jackson, but Davy Crockett actually opposed Andrew Jackson. Crockett was defeated. He was a member of the U.S. Congress. He was defeated when he ran for Congress, and he reputedly said, for those of you that voted against me, you can go to hell. I'm going to Texas. So Crockett comes in with about 20 or 25 Tennesseans into San Antonio. Again, he's one of those folks that's coming to Texas for a new start. And Crockett didn't really want to die in San Antonio. He just kind of ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah, he got to San Antonio, he got involved in the defense of the Alamo, and ultimately it would lead to his death. So you've got Travis's folks loyal to Travis, folks loyal to Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett's men. Davy Crockett was a conciliator, apparently, between Jim Bowie and William Barrett Travis. He tried to kind of work out a compromise between them. And then the fourth group that was in the Alamo was one that's often forgotten. And those are the Tejanos that fought in the Alamo, the Mexican Texans. When I was a kid, the story of the Alamo was kind of really a racial story. It was white people versus brown people. And it turns out that that's not true at all. If you've been paying attention to Tourget or the or the podcast, you'll know that Tejanos, especially elite Tejanos and their followers, were very supportive of Anglos, were anti-Santa Anna. They didn't like Santa Anna's centralism. Uh, they revolted against Santa Anna along with Anglos. Now they become the tragic figures in this story because after Texas becomes independent, these Tejanos become a despised minority. But nonetheless, we're not there yet. But the big point I want to make is that you had Tejanos fighting Santa Anna's army at the Alamo. And many of them were followers of Juan Seguin. They had grown up with Juan Seguin. They were part of his group. They had obligations to him. So you had four factions creating the Texas Army. You had Jim Bowie, William Barry Travis, under nominal command, Davy Crockett, and Juan Seguin. Ultimately, we think between 7 and 9 Tejanos died at the Alamo. So that was the setup of the Alamo, but it hasn't happened yet. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the march and the siege in the next podcast.